The night seemed to swallow everything but the fear. February 7, 1968, outside Hue, South Vietnam, Staff Sergeant Johnny Brooks Jr. could taste metal in his mouth as he hunched over the commander's position in his M48 Patton tank. His heart pounded against his ribs like artillery. The radio crackled with desperate pleas from a marine company pinned down 3 miles ahead. Through his night vision scope, Brooks could make out the muzzle flashes in the distance, North Vietnamese army tanks advancing on the surrounded Americans. "Command orders you to hold position, Staff Sergeant. I repeat, hold position. Wait for air support at dawn." The captain's voice was firm over the radio. Brooks glanced at his watch, 5 more hours until first light. He knew what that meant for the Marines ahead. In 5 hours, there'd be no one left to save. His hand hovered over the radio transmitter. Through the open hatch came the sounds of his 4-man crew waiting for his order. They'd already disabled their running lights. They were ready to move, if he gave the word. Brooks knew the terrain between them and the trapped company was considered impassable for tanks at night, a labyrinth of rice paddies, narrow dikes, and hidden ravines. No American tank commander had attempted a night rescue operation through such terrain in the entire Vietnam conflict. "Staff Sergeant, do you copy? Hold your position." Brooks looked at the faces of his crew: Private Williams, Lance Corporal Rodriguez, Corporal Thompson, and Private First Class Chen. Then he made his decision. He switched off the radio. "We're moving out," he told his men, his voice steady despite the weight of disobedience on his shoulders. "Those are our brothers out there." What followed would become one of the most daring and unconventional tank operations of the Vietnam War. A night march that military historians would later study with awe. Yet in that moment, no one in the 3rd Tank Battalion knew that one man's defiance would rewrite the battlefield tactics for an entire generation of armored commanders. Johnny Brooks Jr. was born on August 12, 1940 in Clarksdale, Mississippi, the son of a World War I veteran who had served in the segregated 371st Infantry Regiment. Growing up in the segregated South, young Johnny learned early about both prejudice and perseverance. His father, a stern but loving man, instilled in him a fierce sense of duty and an unwavering moral compass. "Do what's right, son, even when it's hard," his father would tell him, "especially when it's hard." By the time Johnny was 10 years old, he could already strip and reassemble his father's old hunting rifle, and he displayed an uncanny mechanical aptitude that would serve him well in his future military career. The family's small home sat near a rail yard, and young Johnny spent countless hours watching the massive locomotives, fascinated by how their complex systems worked together. His high school years were marked by both academic excellence and the harsh realities of segregation. Despite being at the top of his class in mathematics and physics, college seemed an impossible dream due to financial constraints. So when a Marine Corps recruiter visited his school in 1958, Brooks saw an opportunity. The Marine Corps had been officially desegregated after President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948, but in practice, Black Marines still faced significant discrimination and limited opportunities for advancement. When Brooks enlisted, the skepticism from the recruiting officer was palpable. "You sure you're cut out for this, son?" the white officer had asked. "The Marines ain't the Army. We don't take just anybody." Brooks had met his gaze steadily. "No, sir. You take the best. That's why I'm here." His early years in the Corps were a test of endurance and character. During basic training at Paris Island, he endured not only the legendary rigor of Marine boot camp, but also the additional burden of racial prejudice from drill instructors and fellow recruits. He was often assigned the most grueling tasks, given fewer breaks, and subjected to extra scrutiny. Yet Brooks never complained, instead channeling his frustration into excellence. "They're waiting for me to fail," he wrote in a letter home. "I refuse to give them that satisfaction." It was during tank training that Brooks found his calling. The complex machinery of the armored vehicles spoke to his natural mechanical talents, and the chess-like strategy of tank warfare appealed to his analytical mind. He scored at the top of his class in both maintenance and tactical operations, forcing even his most prejudiced instructors to acknowledge his abilities. By 1962, Brooks had risen to the rank of sergeant, despite the systemic barriers that slowed promotion for Black Marines. His technical expertise with the M48 Patton tank became legendary within his unit. He could diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone and developed modifications that improved performance in the field, unofficial tweaks that weren't in any manual but spread among tank crews through word of mouth. "Brooks can make these beasts purr like kittens," one white tank commander was overheard saying. "I don't care what color he is, I want him looking at my tank before any operation." When the Vietnam conflict escalated in 1965, Brooks was among the first Marine tank commanders deployed to the region. By then, he'd assembled a crew that trusted him implicitly, men who had seen his skills firsthand and would follow him anywhere. His tank, nicknamed Midnight Rider, became known for always being operational when others were down for maintenance, and for arriving precisely when and where it was needed most in engagements. Yet despite his growing reputation, Brooks remained an outsider in many ways, respected for his abilities, but still facing the prejudice that was endemic in the military of that era. He seldom received formal recognition for his innovations or tactical successes. As one of the few black tank commanders, he was often sidelined during planning sessions, his input solicited only after white officers had their say. "They'll listen when they have to," he told Private Williams one night during their first deployment. "And sometimes that's all you need, that one moment when they have to listen." Little did he know that soon one such moment would define his military career and save dozens of lives. But the Brooks who sat atop his tank that fateful night outside Hue had no inkling that his name would one day be mentioned in the same breath as other innovative tank commanders in military history. He was simply a Marine who saw his brothers in danger and couldn't stand by and watch them die. Sometimes, and he had written to his father just weeks before, "How you have to choose between what's ordered and what's right." Those words would prove prophetic in ways he couldn't have imagined. As his hand reached for the ignition switches, Brooks had a flash of his father's face and a distant memory of his words. "Leadership isn't about giving orders, son. It's about taking responsibility." The weight of that responsibility hung heavy on his shoulders as he signaled for his crew to advance into the darkness, toward the sounds of battle that no one else was willing to approach. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation for dozens of trapped Marines. The Tet Offensive of 1968 represented one of the most significant turning points of the Vietnam War. On January 30th, during the Vietnamese New Year celebration of Tet, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army forces launched a coordinated series of attacks against major cities and provincial capitals across South Vietnam. The surprise offensive shocked American forces and the American public, who had been repeatedly told that the enemy was weakening and victory was within reach. Among the primary targets was the ancient imperial city of Hue, South Vietnam's third largest city and a cultural and intellectual center. The battle that erupted there would become one of the longest and bloodiest of the entire Vietnam conflict, lasting nearly a month and resulting in thousands of casualties on all sides. When NVA and Viet Cong forces stormed into Hue in the early hours of January 31st, they quickly captured most of the city, including the historic citadel. The American and South Vietnamese response was hampered by poor weather, which limited air support, and by the complex urban terrain, which negated many of the technological advantages U.S. forces typically enjoyed. The 3rd Marine Division, including the 3rd Tank Battalion, to which Staff Sergeant Brooks belonged, was dispatched to help retake the city. The fighting was brutal, house to house and often hand to hand, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. By the first week of February, Marine infantry companies were stretched thin, fighting to clear the city while simultaneously defending the tenuous supply lines that ran through the surrounding countryside. It was in this context that Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines found itself in a desperate situation on the evening of February 7th. The company had been dispatched to secure a strategic bridge crossing approximately 5 miles southwest of Hue. Intelligence had indicated only light enemy presence in the area, but the intelligence was catastrophically wrong. As darkness fell, Alpha Company walked into an ambush by a reinforced NVA battalion, supported by a company of Soviet-made T-54 tanks. The Marines found themselves surrounded, outgunned, and with their radio communications partially jammed. Their commanding officer, Captain Michael Harrington, was killed in the opening minutes of the engagement, leaving Lieutenant James Wilson in command of a rapidly deteriorating situation. At 1900 hours, a partial distress call from Alpha Company reached the Marine Command post at Phu Bai Combat Base. The message was fragmented, but clear enough. They were surrounded, taking heavy casualties and facing enemy armor without adequate anti-tank weapons. They needed immediate assistance. The 3rd Tank Battalion, positioned at a forward operating base approximately 8 miles from Alpha Company's location, was the closest armored unit that could potentially provide support. However, the terrain between the Tank Battalion and the besieged Marines presented a formidable challenge. The direct route would require traversing a network of rice paddies intersected by narrow dikes, threading through dense stands of bamboo, and crossing several streams, all in near total darkness. Standard operating procedure dictated that tanks should not attempt such terrain without infantry support, and never at night. When the call for support came in, the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Whitman, assessed the situation grimly. "Air support is grounded due to weather until at least 0600 hours, he informed his officers, and the terrain is impassable for tanks at night. The decision was made to dispatch a relief force at first light, with helicopter gunships providing support, if weather permitted. This was the textbook response, the safe response, the response that aligned with established doctrine. But for Staff Sergeant Johnny Brooks, Jr., commander of Tank Charlie 31, the decision was unacceptable. Having spent months in country, Brooks had developed an intimate understanding of the terrain around Hue. More importantly, he had personally modified his M48 tank with additional external lights that could be shielded to direct illumination downward only, allowing limited visibility without creating a visible signature from a distance. This modification, like many of Brooks' innovations, wasn't officially sanctioned. It had been inspired by his childhood observations of how Mississippi Railroad workers used shielded lanterns to check tracks at night without being visible from a distance. Brooks had implemented the system using scavenged materials and his own technical ingenuity. When he approached Lieutenant Colonel Whitman with a proposal for a night rescue operation, the battalion commander was dismissive. "That's suicide, Staff Sergeant," Whitman had said. "You'd be lighting yourself up for every RPG team between here and Alpha Company's position." "Not with my lighting system, sir," Brooks had countered. "We've tested it on night patrols. It's invisible beyond 50 yards. The colonel had shaken his head. "Even if that works, you're talking about navigating terrain that's challenging in broad daylight. No tank crew has ever attempted something like this at night." "My crew can do it, sir," Brooks had insisted. "We've practiced night maneuvers more than any other crew in the battalion." This was true, though unsanctioned. Brooks had regularly taken his tank out on unauthorized night training exercises, developing techniques for nocturnal navigation and combat that weren't in any field manual. Whitman's final answer had been unequivocal. "Request denied, Staff Sergeant. We move at dawn by the book." That's an order. It was this order that Brooks now deliberately disobeyed as he powered up his tank and began the treacherous journey toward Alpha Company's position. In his mind, the moral imperative to save his fellow Marines outweighed the chain of command. What he couldn't have known was how profoundly this decision would affect the lives of everyone involved, and ultimately, the approach to armored warfare in difficult terrain for decades to come. As the massive M48 Patton tank rumbled to life, Private James Williams shot a nervous glance at Brooks through the dim red glow of the tank's interior lights. "We're really doing this, aren't we, Sarge?" Brooks nodded, his expression resolute. "Radio silence from here on. We're ghosts until we reach Alpha Company." The tank lurched forward, its 52 tons of steel moving with surprising grace under Brooks' skilled guidance. They had disabled the standard running lights, leaving only Brooks' modified system, a series of shielded fixtures that cast a narrow cone of dim blue light directly downward, illuminating only the ground immediately in front of the tank's treads. "Chen, you're my eyes." Brooks called down to Private First Class Henry Chen, the driver seated in the front hull of the tank. "Keep it slow and steady. Rodriguez, watch for bogies on the thermal." Lance Corporal Miguel Rodriguez, the gunner, swiveled the massive 90mm main gun slowly from side to side, scanning through the primitive thermal imaging sight, another of Brooks' unauthorized modifications. adapted from salvaged helicopter equipment. "Nothing yet, Staff Sergeant," Rodriguez reported. "We're clear." The night was moonless, the Vietnamese countryside a tapestry of deep shadows. The first mile went smoothly as they followed a dirt road wide enough to accommodate the tank's bulk. But soon they reached the first major obstacle, a flooded rice paddy stretching before them like a black mirror reflecting the star-filled sky. Standard procedure would have been to detour around, adding precious miles and hours to their journey. Brooks had another idea. "Thompson," he called to Corporal Lee Thompson, the loader, "get out the depth testing equipment." What Brooks euphemistically called equipment was actually a set of bamboo poles marked with cloth strips at various heights, a tool inspired by the methods used by local farmers to test water depth before crossing with their water buffalo. Thompson quickly exited the tank, probing the paddy ahead with practiced efficiency. He returned with a confident nod. 18 inches at the deepest point, Sarge. We can make it straight across." Brooks made a quick calculation. The M48 could ford water up to 4 feet deep, but the real concern was the consistency of the paddy bottom. Too soft, and 52 tons of tank would sink into the mud like a stone. "Chen, engage the widest track setting and keep it under 5 miles per hour, Brooks ordered. Nice and easy. The tank edged forward into the water, its track set to maximum width to distribute its enormous weight. The water rose halfway up the road wheels, but the bottom held. 12 agonizing minutes later, they emerged on the far bank, having shaved nearly an hour off their journey compared to the established route. This pattern repeated itself over the next hour, Brooks consistently choosing the direct path over the safe one, relying on his crew's skill and his own unconventional methods to overcome obstacles that conventional wisdom deemed impassable for tanks at night. They crossed 3 more paddies, navigated a dense bamboo thicket by literally pushing through it, the massive trees snapping like twigs under the tank's bulk, and forded a stream that wasn't even on their maps. Each obstacle was met with the same methodical approach: assess, adapt, overcome. At one point, they encountered a ravine too steep for a direct crossing. Rather than backtrack, Brooks had Chen position the tank perpendicular to the ravine edge. Then, in a maneuver that would have given any tank instructor a heart attack, he ordered the tank to slide down the embankment sideways, using the track's resistance to control their descent. The move risked throwing a track or worse, but it saved them 40 minutes compared to finding a proper crossing point. "Where did you learn that trick, Staff Sergeant?" Williams asked, his voice tight with lingering adrenaline, after they successfully reached the bottom. "Didn't learn it anywhere," Brooks replied simply. "Just figured it might work." This was the essence of Brooks's genius, an intuitive understanding of his machine that transcended training manuals and established doctrine. He operated on a level that combined technical knowledge, spatial awareness, and a willingness to improvise that few tank commanders possessed. 2 hours into their journey, they picked up the distant sound of combat, the distinctive crack of M16 rifles interspersed with the heavier boom of tank fire. They were getting close, but the most dangerous part of their mission still lay ahead. Now they had to approach an active battlefield, where NVA forces would be alert and watching for any sign of reinforcement. Brooks gathered his crew for a final briefing. "Kill all lights, even the modified ones. From here on, we navigate by sound and memory." He unfolded a hand-drawn map, his own creation, based on reconnaissance patrols he'd led weeks earlier. "There's a depression that runs along this tree line. It should give us cover for a final approach to within 500 yards of Alpha's position." Rodriguez looked skeptical. "You're going to find a hidden depression in pitch darkness?" Brooks' expression was calm, assured. "When I was a boy, my father taught me to hunt at night. Said a man who needs his eyes to know where he is isn't really seeing at all." As they closed within a mile of Alpha Company's position, the sounds of battle grew more distinct. Through his night vision scope, Brooks could see muzzle flashes in the distance and the unmistakable silhouette of Soviet-made T-54 tanks advancing on the beleaguered Marines. The radio, which they had kept on receive-only mode to maintain operational silence, crackled with increasingly desperate communications from the surrounded company. "Running critical on ammo. Multiple casualties. Enemy armor closing from the north and east." Brooks made his decision. Their final approach would be from the southwest, coming in behind the NVA tanks that were focusing their attention on the trapped Marine company. "Rodriguez, load heat," he ordered, referring to the high-explosive anti-tank rounds designed to penetrate armored vehicles. "Heat loaded and ready," Rodriguez confirmed as Thompson slammed the 90-pound shell into the breech. "Listen up," Brooks said, his voice steady despite the tension building in his chest. "We're going to hit them from behind. One shot, one kill, then immediate relocation before they can pinpoint us. No sustained engagement until we've thinned their numbers." It was a classic guerrilla tactic, applied to tank warfare, something that went against every principle taught at tank school, where the emphasis was on coordinated assaults with infantry support and clear fields of fire. Private Williams, who monitored the radio and served as the assistant driver, looked up at Brooks. "You know, if we pull this off, they're still going to court-martial you for disobeying orders." Brooks nodded solemnly. "If we don't pull this off, none of us will be around to worry about courts-martial." He paused, glancing at each of his men in turn. "Last chance to back out. Anyone wants to return to base? Speak now. I'll take full responsibility either way." The silence that followed was answer enough. These men had followed Brooks through countless engagements. They trusted him with their lives, and now they were willingly risking those lives and their military careers to follow him on this unauthorized rescue mission. "All right then," Brooks said softly. "Midnight Rider is going hunting." With that, they advanced toward the sound of battle, their tank a dark phantom in the Vietnamese night. What happened in the next 90 minutes would become the stuff of Marine Corps legend, an engagement so audacious, so contrary to established doctrine, that military historians would later study it as a case example of how individual initiative could overcome seemingly impossible odds. And as they closed on the first enemy tank, none of them knew that their actions that night would ultimately save not just Alpha Company, but change the very nature of armored warfare doctrine in the decades to come. The first T-54 appeared as a dark silhouette against the muzzle flashes of its own cannon, its attention fixed on the Marine defensive position 300 yards ahead. Brooks's tank was now less than 200 yards behind it, point-blank range for tank combat. "Target identified," Rodriguez whispered, even though the enemy couldn't possibly hear him over the din of battle. "T-54, 2 o'clock stationary." Brooks confirmed the target through his commander's sight. "Fire when ready." Rodriguez took a deep breath, made a final adjustment, and pressed the firing trigger. The M48's 90mm gun roared, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the surrounding area like a lightning strike. The heat round struck the T-54's engine compartment, penetrating the relatively thin rear armor. The Soviet tank erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in a spectacular secondary explosion that sent its turret cartwheeling through the air. "Target destroyed," Rodriguez reported, his voice clinical despite the violence they'd just unleashed. "Reverse, 20 yards, then left oblique behind that berm," Brooks ordered immediately. Chen responded instantly, backing the tank away from their firing position, just as automatic weapons fire began to probe the darkness where they'd been moments before. The burning T-54 created both a problem and an opportunity. Its flames illuminated the battlefield, potentially exposing Brooks' tank to enemy observation, but also revealed the positions of 2 more T-54s that had been advancing in loose formation with the destroyed tank. The NVA tank commanders were clearly confused, turning their turrets frantically, searching for the unseen attacker that had just destroyed their comrade. Their training told them that American tanks didn't operate independently at night, especially not in this terrain. They were looking for a conventional threat that didn't exist. Brooks used their confusion to his advantage. "New target, Rodriguez. T-54 at our 11 o'clock, moving right to left." "Target acquired," Rodriguez confirmed. "Fire." Another thunderous report. Another direct hit. The second T-54 shuddered as the heat round penetrated its side armor, igniting its fuel and ammunition. The crew attempted to bail out, but only one man emerged from the hatches before the tank was consumed in flames. By now, the NVA infantry supporting the tanks had realized they were under attack from behind. Green tracer fire crisscrossed the darkness, searching for Brooks' tank, which had already relocated to a new firing position behind a small rise. The third T-54 was more cautious, reversing into a defensive position behind the burned-out hulk of the first destroyed tank, using it as cover while its commander tried to locate the threat. "I don't have a shot," Rodriguez reported, frustration evident in his voice. Brooks thought for a moment, then made another unorthodox decision. "Chen, advance directly toward the wreckage. Full speed." "Straight at them?" Chen asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Exactly where they won't expect us to go," Brooks confirmed. "Execute." The M48 surged forward, its massive bulk gathering momentum as it raced toward the burning tank wreckage. The NVA tank commander, expecting an attack from the flanks, was completely unprepared when Brooks' tank suddenly appeared, charging directly at them from behind the cover of the wreckage. At a range of less than 50 yards, practically collision distance in tank warfare, Rodriguez fired their third shot of the engagement. The heat round struck the T-54's turret ring, the weakest point in its armor, causing a catastrophic failure that sent flames shooting out of every hatch and vision port. "3 down," Thompson said, slamming another heat round into the breach. 4 to go. But their success had come at a cost. The muzzle flash from their latest shot, combined with their bold charge, had revealed their position to the NVA infantry. Rocket-propelled grenades began to streak toward them, most missing in the darkness, but one exploding against the tank's frontal armor with a sound like a giant sledgehammer. "Damage report," Brooks called out, checking his instruments. "Frontal armor holding," Chen reported, but that was too close. Brooks knew they had to keep moving or risk being overwhelmed. The element of surprise was diminishing with each passing minute as the NVA forces adjusted to their presence. It was time to change tactics again. "Chen, get us to that tree line, then cut engines." He pointed to a dark mass of vegetation about 100 yards to their right. "We're going to let them think we're withdrawing, then ambush the next wave." As they reached the tree line and shut down their engine, Brooks opened his commander's hatch slightly to listen. The sounds of battle had shifted. The NVA tanks, now aware of an American armor threat behind them, had paused their advance on Alpha Company's position and were regrouping, unsure of how many American tanks they were facing. This hesitation gave the surrounded Marines a crucial respite, exactly what Brooks had hoped for. Through his night vision scope, he could see the remaining 4 T-54s pulling back into a defensive circle, presenting their strongest frontal armor in all directions. It was a textbook response to an ambush, and it played directly into Brooks's hands. With the NVA tanks now stationary and focused outward, they were no longer pressuring Alpha Company. More importantly, they had conceded the initiative, allowing Brooks to choose the time and place of the next engagement. "They think they're facing a full company of tanks," he told his crew, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. "Let's not disappoint them." For the next 40 minutes, Brooks executed a masterful display of guerrilla tank warfare. They would start their engine, race to a new firing position, take a single shot at one of the T-54s, then immediately relocate before return fire could find them. After each shot, they would shut down completely for 5 to 10 minutes, letting the battlefield settle before choosing their next move. To the NVA commanders, it must have seemed like they were surrounded by ghosts, phantom tanks that appeared, struck with devastating accuracy, and vanished into the night. The psychological impact was as damaging as the physical destruction. By midnight, Brooks and his crew had destroyed 2 more T-54s, bringing their total to 5 enemy tanks eliminated. The remaining 2 Soviet tanks, perhaps finally realizing they were facing a single American tank, operating with extraordinary skill rather than a full company, attempted to withdraw toward their own lines. Brooks faced a critical decision: let them go or pursue. Pursuit would mean leaving the relative safety of the broken terrain they'd been using for cover and advancing into more open ground where the NVA had established defensive positions. "What's the call, Staff Sergeant?" Thompson asked as they watched the heat signatures of the retreating tanks through the thermal sight. Brooks was silent for a moment, weighing the risks. Allowing the tanks to escape meant they could return with reinforcements. Pursuing them meant potentially overextending and exposing themselves to concentrated anti-tank fire. "We've bought Alpha Company some breathing room," he said finally. But 2 tanks can still do a lot of damage if they regroup and come back. He made his decision. We pursue, but smartly. There's a parallel draw about 300 yards to our left. We can use it to flank their withdrawal route. For the next 20 minutes, they executed a high-speed flanking maneuver, pushing their tank to its operational limits as they raced to cut off the retreating T-54s. The terrain was treacherous, a maze of bomb craters and debris-choked gullies, but Chen navigated it with remarkable skill, following Brooks' rapid-fire directions. They reached the interception point just as the 2 NVA tanks were passing, catching them in a perfect crossfire position. Rodriguez didn't need to be told. He fired as soon as he had a clean shot, his heat round catching the trailing T-54 directly in the fuel tanks. The resulting explosion was so violent that the concussion rocked Brooks' tank despite being 100 yards away. The lead tank, now aware of the threat, accelerated and began weaving erratically, making itself a difficult target. Rodriguez tracked it, waiting for the perfect moment as the distance between them increased with each second. "Steady," Brooks urged, watching the fleeing tank through his sight. "Wait for it." The T-54 made a critical mistake, swerving to avoid a crater and momentarily presenting its side profile. Rodriguez fired. The 90mm round arced through the darkness, covering the 200 yards in a fraction of a second before striking the T-54's turret junction. The Soviet tank slewed to a halt, smoke pouring from its hatches, its crew bailing out into the night. "That's 7, Williams said quietly, a note of awe in his voice. "Staff Sergeant, you just took out 7 T-54s with 1 tank." There was no time to celebrate. Brooks immediately directed Chen to turn them toward Alpha Company's position. With the NVA armor eliminated, the beleaguered Marines still faced a substantial infantry force. Brooks' tank could tip the balance there as well. As they approached Alpha Company's defensive perimeter, Brooks opened radio communications for the first time since beginning their unauthorized mission. "Alpha Company, this is Charlie 3-1. Approaching your position from the southwest. Hold your fire, friendlies coming in." There was a moment of shocked silence before a voice responded, thick with emotion and disbelief. "Charlie 3-1, this is Lieutenant Wilson. Did you say you're approaching from the southwest? How the hell did you get through the NVA lines?" "We made our own lines, Lieutenant," Brooks replied simply. "Enemy armor has been neutralized. 7 T-54s destroyed. Request permission to join your perimeter." What the young lieutenant said next would be quoted in Marine training for decades to come. "Staff Sergeant, after what you just did, you can park that tank wherever the hell you want." As the massive M48 rumbled into Alpha Company's defensive position, Marines stared in disbelief. Many had given up hope of surviving until dawn. Now, against all odds, a single tank had changed the course of the battle, destroying the enemy armor that had nearly overwhelmed them. Lieutenant Wilson, his uniform caked with mud and blood, approached as Brooks emerged from the commander's hatch. "Staff Sergeant, I don't know how you got here or who authorized this, but you just saved what's left of my company." Brooks surveyed the Marine position, dozens of wounded being treated in hastily dug foxholes, ammunition nearly depleted, and expressions of exhaustion and relief on filthy faces. "Couldn't leave you out here, sir." As dawn broke over the battlefield, revealing the carnage of the night's fighting, Brooks stood beside his tank, watching medical evacuation helicopters land to extract Alpha Company's wounded. The sight of 7 destroyed T-54s scattered across the battlefield, all felled by a single American tank, had already spread among the Marines like wildfire. What Brooks didn't know then was how quickly the story would travel up the chain of command, creating both admiration and consternation in equal measure. He had directly disobeyed orders, taken extraordinary risks, and violated nearly every principle of conventional armored warfare doctrine. He had also saved Alpha Company from certain destruction and demonstrated the potential of tanks in terrain previously considered impassable. The immediate aftermath of Brooks's night march was a study in military contradiction. He was simultaneously recommended for the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration awarded for valor, and threatened with court-martial for disobeying direct orders. His battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Whitman, was caught between acknowledging Brooks's extraordinary achievement and maintaining the discipline essential to military operations. In the end, pragmatism prevailed. The potential public relations disaster of court-martialing a black Marine who had single-handedly saved dozens of American lives was too great a risk, especially given the growing civil rights movement back home and the already fragile public support for the Vietnam War. Instead, Brooks received an official reprimand in his service record, a punishment that would block any future promotion beyond his current rank, alongside the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. It was an uncomfortable compromise that satisfied no one completely, but allowed the Marine Corps to save face while still recognizing Brooks's valor. For the men of Alpha Company, however, there was no ambiguity. They knew exactly who had saved them and how. Lieutenant Wilson, in his after-action report, wrote, "Staff Sergeant Brooks' actions represent the highest traditions of the Marine Corps. His courage, initiative, and tactical brilliance directly resulted in the survival of this company when all conventional wisdom said we were lost." Private First Class Michael Donahue, one of the wounded Marines evacuated that morning, would later write in a letter to Brooks, "They told us tanks couldn't move at night in that terrain. They told us we had to hold until dawn. They told us a lot of things that turned out not to matter because you decided we weren't going to die out there. I have 3 children now who wouldn't exist if you had followed orders that night." Brooks returned to his unit and continued to serve with distinction through the remainder of his deployment. His crew, Williams, Rodriguez, Thompson, and Chen, received Bronze Stars for their part in the night action. More significantly, they remained fiercely loyal to Brooks, defending his methods and decisions to anyone who questioned them. After Vietnam, Brooks faced the same challenges that confronted many returning veterans, compounded by the persistent racism of the era. He retired from the Marine Corps in 1975, having reached the rank of Master Sergeant, the highest he could achieve with the reprimand in his record. He returned to Mississippi and opened a small automotive repair shop, applying the same mechanical genius to civilian vehicles that he had once used to modify his tank. Few of his customers ever knew about his heroism in Vietnam. Brooks rarely spoke of his service and never mentioned the night outside Hue when he had accomplished what many considered impossible. But within the Marine Corps, particularly among tankers, the story lived on. Instructors at the Armor School began incorporating Brooks' ride into their tactical discussions, often unofficially at first, later as a formal case study in initiative and unconventional problem-solving. By the 1980s, the Marines had officially revised their doctrine regarding tank operations in difficult terrain and low light conditions. The new manuals incorporated many of the techniques that Brooks had improvised that fateful night, including his shielded lighting system, which became standard equipment on M60 tanks and later the M1 Abrams. Colonel James Mattison, who served as an instructor at the Armor School from 1982 to 1987, often told his students, "There are textbook operations, and then there are Brooks operations. Learn the textbook so you know the rules. Then learn about Brooks so you know when to break them." In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, the commander of a Marine tank company in Iraq explicitly cited Brooks' tactics when he led his unit through terrain considered impassable at night to outflank an Iraqi Republican Guard position. "We're doing a Brooks maneuver," he told his platoon leaders before the operation. Every one of them understood exactly what that meant. By the time Brooks passed away in 2011, at the age of 71, his night march had become much more than a footnote in military history. It had evolved into a case study in leadership, moral courage, and tactical innovation. The reprimand in his service record had long since been overshadowed by his enduring influence on armored warfare doctrine. At his funeral, attended by dozens of Marines from multiple generations, a former commandant of the Marine Corps summarized Brooks' legacy. Staff Sergeant Brooks showed us that terrain is only impassable until someone passes it. Obstacles are only insurmountable until someone surmounts them. And orders are only sacred when they don't conflict with our sacred duty to never leave Marines behind. Among the mourners was an elderly man few recognized, retired Lieutenant James Wilson, once the desperate young officer commanding what remained of Alpha Company outside Hue. He placed his Bronze Star on Brooks' casket with shaking hands. "I've had this for 43 years, he said quietly. "It was always his." In 2016, Researchers at the Marine Corps University uncovered previously classified documents that revealed another dimension to Brooks's story. In the weeks following his night march, intelligence analysts had confirmed that the NVA force surrounding Alpha Company had been preparing for a major assault on Marine positions around Hue. The 7 T-54 tanks Brooks destroyed represented nearly one-third of the NVA's total armored strength in the region at that time. Their loss forced the North Vietnamese to delay and ultimately abandon their planned offensive, potentially saving hundreds of additional American lives. This revelation prompted renewed calls for Brooks to be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, a recognition many felt he had been denied due to the racial prejudices of the era. Though the campaign ultimately proved unsuccessful due to procedural requirements, it brought Brooks's story to a new generation of Marines and civilians alike. Today, at the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia, visitors can see a detailed diorama depicting Brooks' Night March. The accompanying plaque reads, "On February 7, 1968, Staff Sergeant Johnny Brooks, Jr. led his tank crew on an unauthorized night mission through impassable terrain to rescue a surrounded Marine company outside Hue. In the engagement that followed, Brooks destroyed 7 enemy tanks and helped save over 40 Marines. His actions demonstrated the highest traditions of the Corps: courage, initiative, and unwavering commitment to fellow Marines." What the plaque doesn't mention is that the museum curators initially struggled to create an accurate model of Brooks' modified tank. As no official documentation of his unauthorized improvements existed, they eventually located Private First Class Chen, the last surviving member of Brooks's crew, who at 82 years old provided detailed sketches from memory of the lighting system and other modifications that had made the night march possible. "Brooks was always tinkering with that tank," Chen told the curators. "The manual said it couldn't do this or that, but he'd just smile and say, 'The tank doesn't know what the manual says.' That philosophy, that innovation often requires looking beyond established doctrine, became Brooks' most enduring legacy." Today, Marine tank commanders are explicitly encouraged to think creatively about the capabilities of their vehicles, to test boundaries, and to develop tactics that expand, rather than simply follow the manual. The annual Brooks Challenge at the Marine Corps Armor School requires tank crews to navigate terrain and complete objectives that conventional wisdom deems impossible, often at night and without standard equipment. The trophy awarded to the winning crew is a simple brass compass, a reference to Brooks' navigation skills during his night march, inscribed with his most famous quote, "Sometimes you have to choose between what's ordered and what's right." For the men Brooks saved that night, there was never any question that he made the right choice. In 2008, 3 years before Brooks's death, Alpha Company held a reunion in Washington, D.C. 23 survivors attended, many with children and grandchildren. They dedicated a memorial plaque listing the names of those lost in the battle and those saved by Brooks' intervention. At the bottom of the plaque was a simple inscription, "When the road seemed impassable, he made a path." Staff Sergeant Robert Gaines, who served in Iraq in 2004, perhaps best summarized Brooks' influence on modern Marine tankers. "We train with night vision, thermal imaging, GPS, and computerized fire control systems that Brooks couldn't have imagined. But every tanker knows that someday that technology might fail. When it does, we don't ask what the manual says. We ask, what would Brooks do?" This question, what would Brooks do, has transcended its military origins to become a broader metaphor for moral courage and innovative problem-solving under pressure. In corporate leadership seminars, emergency response training, and even civilian educational programs, Brooks's story is cited as an example of how rigid adherence to established procedures can sometimes cost lives, while thoughtful rule-breaking can save them. Dr. Marion Stevenson, who includes Brooks's case in her leadership curriculum at Harvard Business School, explains, "What makes Brooks's story so compelling isn't just what he accomplished that night. It's the moral clarity with which he acted. He wasn't rebelling for the sake of rebellion. He was choosing a harder, riskier path because lives depended on it." Perhaps the most powerful testament to Brooks's legacy came 50 years after his night march, when Marine Corps Commandant General Robert Nielsen officially dedicated February 7th as Brooks Day in the tanker community. A day when Marines are encouraged to study and discuss cases where initiative and moral courage should override strict adherence to orders. In his dedication speech, General Nielsen said, "The Marine Corps values discipline and the chain of command, but we also value judgment and moral courage." Staff Sergeant Brooks embodied the difficult truth that sometimes being a good Marine means making hard choices between competing values. His legacy reminds us that we don't just need Marines who follow orders. We need Marines who can think for themselves when those orders conflict with our core mission, to protect our fellow Marines and accomplish our objectives. For Brooks himself, such recognition would likely have seemed excessive. Those who knew him described a humble man who viewed his actions that night not as extraordinary, but as simply necessary. As he once told a young Marine who asked about the night march years later, "I didn't do anything special, I just did what needed doing." This understated assessment belies the exceptional nature of Brooks' achievement. In a single night with 1 tank and 4 crewmen, he destroyed 7 enemy tanks, saved dozens of Marine lives, disrupted an enemy offensive, and ultimately changed how the military thought about the capabilities of armored vehicles in difficult terrain. His story serves as a powerful reminder that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, from those who see possibilities where others see only limitations. In the rigid hierarchy of military organization, it was a staff sergeant from Mississippi, facing both the enemy ahead and the institutional constraints behind, who demonstrated that terrain is only impassable until someone finds a way through. When Marine tanks rolled through the impassable terrain of Afghanistan's Helmand province in 2009, their commanders carried with them the lessons of Brooks' night march. When armored units navigated the narrow streets of Fallujah in 2004, they employed techniques that traced their lineage directly to Brooks' innovations. And when Marine tankers train today for the unknown battlefields of tomorrow, they still ask themselves, what would Brooks do? The answer, as Brooks demonstrated on that February night in 1968, is simple but profound. Do what needs to be done, regardless of what the manual says is impossible. In military academies today, cadets and officer candidates study historical examples of when following orders led to disaster, and when breaking them led to success. Brooks's night march stands as one of the clearest examples of the latter, a case where disobedience saved lives and accomplished the mission when obedience would have resulted in failure and death. Colonel Catherine Martinez, who teaches military ethics at Annapolis, poses a simple question to her students after they study Brooks' case. Was Staff Sergeant Brooks right to disobey orders that night? The discussion that follows is always nuanced, weighing the importance of military discipline against moral imperatives and mission objectives. But as one midshipman responded, if being right means saving 43 Marines who would otherwise have died, then yes, he was right. And I hope I would have the courage to make the same decision in his place. This is perhaps Brooks' most important legacy, not just the tactical innovations or the lives saved on that specific night, but the ongoing conversation about moral courage and judgment in military leadership. In a profession where following orders is foundational, Brooks's story provides a crucial counterexample, a reminder that sometimes the greatest service requires the moral courage to break the rules. As the tank crew of Charlie 3-1 demonstrated that night outside Hue, sometimes the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death, comes down to one person willing to say, "This is impossible, and we're going to do it anyway." Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? Would you have risked court-martial to save fellow Marines or adhered to the chain of command despite knowing the human cost? These are not just historical questions about a tank commander's decision in 1968. They are timeless questions about moral courage, initiative, and the sometimes competing values of discipline and compassion. The next time you hear someone say something can't be done, remember Staff Sergeant Johnny Brooks, Jr. and his night march outside Hue, when one man's defiance rewrote what was possible, saved 43 lives, and changed military doctrine for generations to come. Share this story so others remember what courage really means, not just following orders, but knowing when the mission and your fellow soldiers require more. Because sometimes the most important order is the one you give yourself, to do what needs to be done, regardless of what the manual says.